Welcome, friends, to the Someone Gets Me podcast. I am your host, Dianne Allen, and I am so delighted that you're here. This podcast was created because I believe there is a visionary leader inside each one of us who is waiting to be seen. In each episode of Someone Gets Me, you will hear useful tips from successful visionaries who will share their stories about how being seen has allowed them to take their vision out into the world with action. Hi friends, it's Dianne here, and we have a great interview on this storytelling series for you that you're really going to love. We've had Jason Schneider on the show before talking about NLP and NeuroSemantics and things like that. It was an overview of which I'll put in the show notes. But I asked him to come back on the show, and he so graciously said yes, to talk more about the stories in our minds and the storytelling and how it all really plays into our health and our welfare or our demise, or our upset. I've taken some classes with Jason since that interview. And what I've learned is there's a lot of power in stories, more than even I realized at the time. So I asked the master to come and help us understand a bit more about the power of stories. So welcome to the show, Jason. Thank you for coming back a second time.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
It's so much fun. And for anybody who doesn't already know who you are, I feel like everybody should know who you are, but we know that that's not the case. Would you share a little bit about who Jason is and how you got into this great neurosemantic world and whatever your heart feels led to say about who you are and why you do this work?
So talking about stories, actually, it's pretty funny because whenever someone asks me to tell my story, there's so many different ways that I could go about it and so many different parts that could be highlighted. Well, I'm founder of PerceptionAcademy.com. I've been doing this working in this field of neurolinguistics and neurosemantics for 10 years now. And it's been a pretty amazing journey going from where I was, which was for the most part bedridden and chronic pain and basically not having any ability to take care of myself or any hope for the future, to over the past 10 years of taking these tools and skills for understanding language and meaning and meaningfulness and being able to take more control over my story and to go from where I was then to being able to have the opportunity to have healed myself a great way, which at the time I didn't know was possible, and to have my own business, being able to help other people to communicate more effectively, to lead themselves and others better, and to really have better control over their emotions and more ability to achieve their outcomes.
Oh, that's great. It's amazing because you hear about healing stories all the time from different people in different ways. And your story is profound. You shared it on the last podcast in more detail, but it's amazing that you did it without anything other than using your mind and the understanding of meaning and linguistics and how you think and the way you speak to yourself. That shows the power of our mind. I always tell everybody that our brain believes our own voice above all others, and it believes us, even if it's not true. So what I'd like to know about a little bit, or we can start here, I guess, is when you're working with somebody and you're just teaching them about the beginning of NLP and neurosemantics and they're kind of getting their feet wet, what would be something that you would help them know about stories that would help them learn it better? Like where do the stories come into all of this? Because I know that there's lots of different pieces, but where do the stories really come in?
So one of the first things that I teach on day one of NLP practitioner certification or NLP practitioner training is that we have one belief, and you'll remember this from the training course, which is that the map is not the territory. And that's that's the foundational. If you get anything from NLP, you have to understand that the map is not the territory. And what that means is that your ideas are not the thing. Your perceptions are not the world. That anything that you experience, that you perceive, that you think, that you understand, that you believe, any memories that you have about the past, all of that stuff is just a map of this territory that we're living in. And that your maps cannot be the real thing because they have to get filtered down through your senses. And so even from the first minute of an NLP training, you're learning that which you perceive and you have been perceiving as reality your whole life is actually nothing more than a filtered down version It's a filtered down version, just like if you have a map of Fort Lauderdale, a map of Miami, a map of the United States, a map of the world, that the map itself is not the thing. That to go from a thing into a map, stuff needs to be deleted because you can't fit all the real stuff onto the map. Stuff needs to be generalized and stuff needs to be distorted. And so as soon as we start perceiving the world, immediately we're generalizing, we're distorting, and we're deleting details, and we're left with this map of the world that's not the world. And that's the cool thing about stories, is that that's exactly how stories work. It's that as you hear stories, or you tell about other people, or you tell yourself stories about your life, or you hear stories about the past, or the history, about the world, about your country, about your religious background, about your community group, about your family. All those stories they are not the real thing. They're just maps that individuals can hold on to and pass on to each other to give us direction about how to navigate the world. Primarily how to survive in the world, and ultimately, ideally, they would help us to thrive in the world. But any story, anything that you're telling yourself that someone else has told you, it must have been deleted, generalized, and distorted from the real thing. And so it could not be the real thing. And so it's these stories inside of us that drive all of our emotions, that drive all of our behaviors, and also it's through the power of story and communication that we then can share with each other for, like you said, for the greater good, or even to our demise.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I remember it now when you were saying all of that. I remember, and I have a client recently who really struggles with the mental story that he tells himself about not being good enough, being late, wasted so much time, can't handle it, like all of these things. He really struggles with being stuck in that story. Even though when I can get him out of the story, or we meditate, or we do something else, and he can see for moments that he's not the story, that's not it. He's just saying it to himself. It is so believable to him that it paralyzes him. Do you ever see anybody paralyzed like that?
Yeah, I've been that person. I used to look in the mirror and see that person. In fact, probably sometimes I still am, and I don't even realize it. Yeah, I mean, it's so powerful. See, the most powerful thing about stories, actually, and you've touched on it twice already in this call, and I'm just going to kind of mark it out using NLP language, NeuroSemantics language, is the power of belief and the relationship of belief with stories. Because it's funny, we can hear stories from other people, and if we don't believe them, then they don't have any power over our lives. We go, oh, well, that's just a story. But when you take a story, our whole lives are nothing more than a set of stories. I mean, our past, what really exists is the moment of now. And so your whole entire past, or your whole entire perceived direction of how the future is going to be for you or the world, is nothing more than a set of stories, a set of experiences that you've then highlighted, and then some of them you believe in and some of them you don't. And so the ones that you believe in actually is the power of belief is what actually empowers stories to drive the direction of our emotions, the direction of our lives, which is nothing more than a story about the story. And so a belief is just a story about a story, and the story about the story with the belief is that the story is true. And if you have a story about the story that the story is not true, then it's amazing how it tends to not drive your neurology. And so, like, throughout our stories, some of them we highlight, and some of them we diminish and we background. And yeah, so it's quite fascinating to me about how people can have actually lots of reference experiences that point them in the other direction from a story that they've been telling themselves, but because of the power of belief creating self-fulfilling prophecies, that they then kind of delete or background or discount the stories that actually would change the direction of their life, change the overall narrative.
Wow. So we have stories about our stories. and then depending on how much we believe the story that's about the story, then that determines how much power it has in our life. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes, 100%. You think we just have stories? No, we tell stories about our stories. We even tell stories about our stories about our stories. We are storytellers by extraordinaires as human beings. And in fact, the higher level of the story, the more impactful and profound it's going to be on your life. I mean, you have someone, like, even communication, it's a negotiation of stories. So someone tells you a story about how they think things are, and you might go, yeah, I believe that story. Or, yeah, I agree. Oh yeah, that's the same story that I have in my mind-body system. And then there's other times when someone tells a story and you go, well, no, that's not the way things are. And now we get into this like negotiation about which story are we going to choose to live by. Is it going to be your story? Am I going to take on your story? Are you going to take on my story? Are we going to agree to disagree and kind of, or maybe you're going to update your story a little bit and I'll update my story a little bit? It's actually much more of a complicated web, I think, than it seems at first glance.
Wow. And, I work with a lot of people, as you know, who are gifted and usually can have 2 or 3 trains of thought going on at the same time, sometimes more. And I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, well, that could happen within the same person, where part of them has one belief about something, a story, and another part of them has another part of the story about the same thing, and it's different. And so now they have an inner conflict because they're telling alternate stories to themselves at different times.
100%. I mean, that's the foundation of being out of rapport with yourself, being incongruent with yourself. And just to tie things up a little bit more is that the story about that story is very profound as well, because some people, for example, don't do well with having 2 conflicting stories within themselves. And so the story about having 2 conflicting stories is that when I have this, the story about that is that it's not okay, that I must resolve this, that there's something wrong with me, and other people, at other times, the story about that story is, well, I haven't found a solution yet. And so, there's something else to explore here. Maybe there's some other stories that are in conflict with each other. And so actually, one of the definitions of wisdom that I really love is that, and I'm going to twist it a little bit in the theme of stories, is that the definition of wisdom is being able to hold multiple conflicting stories in yourself and be comfortable with that, and be able to call upon different ones at different times based on what's best for the moment, and not taking one story as the ultimate story, but being able to hold multiple ways of explaining things, different explanatory models of the same thing in you, without feeling a discomfort, or without having them necessarily needing to fight, even when they're conflicting, to not have conflict.
Wow, that's wisdom. Because I'm sitting here thinking about how I've had lots of epiphanies in my life where I've grown to that point where I can have 2 completely divergent things, or things that are really different, hold both of them and still go, oh, okay, and notice it and acknowledge it and see it, but not have an emotional response that sends me off anywhere. It's just kind of like, oh, well, that's interesting. Oh, so I must be getting more wise. This is great.
Right. See? I like that story.
I like that story. I have a belief that that's a good story, so that will make me laugh.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And also, see, one of the cool things, one of the coolest stories that I love to hear about is about people who are self-actualizing. So those are some pretty fascinating stories about these people, whether they're still in existence or alive now, or people from the past who have been able to unlock their highest potential and to become their best version of themselves, and to kind of not transcend them fully, but find ways of meeting their human needs, and then being able to balance their humanness and their godlike nature at the same time, and to become better and more. And I think people have always been attracted to stories like that. And so being able to study those stories is something that's been really, really fascinating to me as well. And being able to understand the stories that people who are like that tell themselves, and how they navigate the world, has been always fascinating to me.
Oh yeah, that is fascinating. It's funny because I'm working on a book right now for light workers and people who are helping people awaken in the world, whatever they want to call themselves, which you're one of them. And we were thinking about how everybody who is here kind of bringing a great message, some of them don't realize the power of the message, really. Some of them do. Like all these different variances of the story they tell themselves about their own role in this awakening that's happening all around us. And one of the things I like about the storytelling paradigm that you share is it makes it all manageable, where it doesn't seem like such big woo-woo universal thing. Oh my God, it's so big I can't function. Where do I go? I don't even know where to start. It undoes that opportunity to be paralyzed because it's very manageable. And here's the way it can go, and it's transcendent and then very grounded at the same time. And you're reminding me of that. It's like, it's really powerful, I think, to realize that there's much more going on than what meets the eye on the outside.
Yeah, and that's kind of like one of the things that's fascinating to me, to keep the theme of stories, is that all stories come from experience. At least, even the most like made up, imaginary, fantastical, dreamy Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. I mean, even those stories, they're all, the reason why they connect with us as human beings is because they're grounded in experience. That the story, especially the stories we tell ourselves about our lives, is that we have an experience, and so the distinction I make here is between like primary experience, meaning the stuff you see, smell, taste, hear, feel, like you actually experience it in the world. Like someone who's listening to this conversation right now, or I'm seeing you right now. And so that's like primary experience. And the stories at primary experience are told using sensory-based language. And so you will say things like, I see you sitting there with that quilt behind your head, and you've got a beautiful, now we're starting to get into a different realm of story, but you've got a smile on your face and you're nodding your head. And so and I can see the green leaves on the side of the windowsill. And so stories like that are told at the primary level are very translatable into, they're very agreeable, meaning that like I could tell you that story and there's not much that someone could argue with if they're experiencing the same thing. But the stories, like I said, that we tell about those stories, the kind of evaluative stories, the judgmental stories, in both ways, evaluating things as good or bad, or judging things as bad or good, those stories now are one level removed from reality. They're one level removed, and they get even more subjective. And then the stories about those stories become a second level removed and even more subjective. And so one of the cool ways to straighten out our psychological stories in terms of like to have healthy, sane, not insane, but like not sane versus insane, but more accurate, more healthy stories in our lives is to take these kind of stories about the stories and to bring them back down to primary reality, where we live, where real life happens, where the world happens. And when we can do that, that's a really cool way to break down stories and come back down to the real story of living in the moment. There's a cool quote by this guy, Fritz Perls, the Gestalt therapist, one of the original wizards or psychotherapists that were modeled by the original NLPers, that was lose your mind and come to your senses. And that's another way of saying, like, get rid of your stories about the stories and just live the story, be in the moment, be the story.
Right. Lose your mind and come to your senses. That's a great one. And I have a lot of people that I know, my colleagues and stuff, that say, well, you have to release the story in order to be free. And they're talking about the same thing that you're saying. And I heard somebody once challenge that, one of the people saying, well, if I release the story, I'm going to forget. And I say, no, I don't think we forget. I think it's all in us all the time anyway. But I think what shifts is the power it has, and where its place within our autobiography, I think, at that point. And so what do you think about that? Is that what you see happen when you're helping people with all their stories and things? Do you see that? Do they forget things, or do they just change where they go? I mean, I know that's a real general kind of weird question, but I kind of wonder about what happens when we have that awareness about the stories. Then what happens?
Yeah. So that like, I want to get there, and I feel like this is going to get super awesomely tangled as we do. So, but I'm super open to explore territory with you and see where we go. And so, like, one of the cool things that comes to my mind first is recognizing that our story, we're talking about like our past story about ourselves and our lives, and that those stories have profound impact on our personality and on our emotions and on our behaviors, and then obviously ultimately on our future direction and the life that we're going to lead and the results that we're going to get and the legacy that we're going to leave and all that is nothing more than a bunch of cherry-picked stories. So it's like, how many days do you drive the same way to work, and you tend to delete most of the stuff that has sameness. And so a lot of the times as human beings, the stories that we that we use to really connect with our personality are the ones that had significant emotional impact, whether good or bad. Another way of saying that they had significant emotional impact is saying that they were meaningful or semantically loaded, as we would say in neurosemantics. And sometimes it's just so random and obscure, like just happened to be the way that things worked out, that like this one moment got highlighted in our lives as emotionally significant, even though in the grand scheme of things, it was 5 minutes out of the 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years of your life. I don't know how many minutes are in 60 years, but those 5 minutes or 5 hours really are not that significant for all of them. But in terms of the story of our life, that chapter happens to have an extra, that chapter's 200 pages and all the other chapters are just 2. And so it's like, obviously that chapter's written in bold in a giant font, and the pages are bigger and they've got colored illustrations in them, just to give them an extra impact. And so anyways, so our history itself is just like different chapters have been it's totally distorted, and things are deleted and things are generalized. So when I'm working with people in like a coaching context, one of the things that I'm aiming to do is I'm aiming to make their stories more accurate. Let's say that the unresourceful stories, we're trying to make them more accurate. So whereas the unresourceful stories have been overgeneralized and distorted in ways that create these negative emotional impact responses and habits, we're trying to make those more accurate and going, it's not that I'll never amount to anything. It's that I fell off my bike once. It's like making it more accurate, bringing it back down to that primary reality story. And then in other areas, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build up more resourceful stories to tell ourselves, more useful stories, which tend to be more accurate just by nature, that there is no such thing as failure, that there is only learning, that, like a lot of people have a story about problems, that problems are horrible and I don't like them, and a more resourceful story to tell ourselves about problems, and that problems are awesome and they're what allow me to grow. And so it's kind of funny, but one of the things that we do is we take unresourceful stories and make them more accurate, meaning we remove the story and we come back down to the reality. But in other ways, we're building more useful stories to be able to better adapt to the world. I mean, I don't want to ramble here, but if you think about like the apps in your phone, right? So each app in your phone, it's governed by some sort of a programming. And those programming is written in language, which composes the story of that program. And every program has a purpose. And if it's running its purpose, then it's working perfectly well, or it's working accurately enough, let's say, to achieve the outcome, then that's a program you'd like to have in your phone. Now, even the best program in the world can always be updated. Because, well, as time goes on and you grow and you develop, there's ways that you can refine the story, that you can enrich the story, that you can enhance the story, that you can make the story work better to achieve the certain outcome that you want it to achieve. And so sometimes the best thing to do is to delete an app. Sometimes the best thing to do is to replicate an app. Sometimes the best thing to do is to continually update your apps over and over again, because see, even if you were writing the story of your life every single day, every minute, every day, every hour, if you were to keep writing, you could take the same story and make it more rich, more robust, more compelling, more amazing. And so it's a great thing to do if you're working on your good stories, your resourceful stories, creating amazing futures for yourself and others, and the world. And it's not such a great thing to do if you're focusing on the bad stories and really detailing those out to scare the crap out of yourself, or to depress yourself, or to anxiety yourself, or anything like that.
Well, so you could take some of those stories that are anxiety producing and really embellish them in your mind, and then pretty soon we have a panic attack or something like, where we can create a real like emotional response that largely is just an exaggeration of something else that might be a little upsetting, but doesn't have to like send us, to our knees.
And if you want to know the difference between one versus the other, the question is does the response justify the sensory-based trigger in the moment? If you're sitting in the house by yourself and you're having a panic attack and there's not like a lion about to attack you, then the response is so significantly blown out of proportion in relationship to the actual context that you're in. And so that's a great way to know if you're having what we would call like an actual reaction to something in the world, or if you're having what we would call a semantic reaction, a reaction to a story or meaning.
Oh, that makes a lot of clarity for a lot of people, I'm sure, because I've heard a lot of people say, I'm just sitting around doing nothing, and then all of a sudden I get anxious, and then pretty soon I'm having a panic attack. And so what we're hearing here is that it's a story that even if they're not aware of it, they're telling or running a story in their mind that is creating that, whether they're aware of it or not. And that's where the work needs to happen is hold on, let's become aware of what we're really doing in here. So we can then choose a different outcome if we don't want to sit around having panic attacks all the time or being upset all the time or angry all the time or whatever it would be.
Yeah, you got it. Just looking at is my response, is it proportional to the actual situation that I'm in? If it's not, then the response isn't due to the situation, it's due to a story. And the more profound, the more strong, the more extreme the response in relationship to the actual environment that you're sitting in, the more deep, the more enriched, the more intense the story is. So the good news is if you're really good at scaring the crap out of yourself or anxietying yourself, then you're a fantastic storyteller and you've got a great skill that can be leveraged to actually create amazing futures for yourself versus somebody who kind of lives kind of a bland, dull, and boring life and doesn't have this powerful skill to tell amazing stories yet.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Like I like how you just said they don't have the power to tell these amazing stories yet, because we all can learn it. That's really cool. That's amazing. I love it. So in your work with people, when you're like coaching, because you do individual coaching with people and you also do trainings, all different kinds. You just did a long 8-day one not long ago. And I've come to a couple of them that I think they were 3 days. They were wonderful. But you work with people individually too. And so what would be a typical kind of success story, or maybe tell us a little bit about, just pick out of your hat a scenario and what kind of things you did or what happened to help transform that person. So everybody can get a flavor of if we were going to call Jason and say, help me. And I have this thing and I'm like, emotional basket case or whatever it is. What do you do? How does it work?
So that's an interesting question because I've been doing a lot more training now than I have been doing kind of private one-on-one work, but I do keep some one-on-one clients so that I can stay sharp and I do get really good results with people in terms of such a wide variety of things. But the way the sessions normally work is that someone comes in and all I am is curious about what stories are you telling yourself? How is it that you get yourself to create whatever problem it is that you're experiencing in your reality? Because the problems aren't a real thing. That's an interesting thing, is that all problems are stories. I'll say that again, is that problems are not real things. All problems are stories because you can't walk outside of the house and trip over a problem. You can trip over a pile of dog poop in your driveway, but it's not a problem until you experience it that way. And someone else could look at that dog poop and say, ooh, free fertilizer for my garden. And so all problems are just psychological stories that we're telling ourselves. A problem takes a problem creator. And if you're experiencing a problem, then you're the one creating that problem in your experience, because the same exact reality could be going on around you. And there's another way of telling yourself a story about that can turn it into a resource or a solution for you. And that's another thing about problems, is that inside of every problem lies the solution, because the problem is nothing more than a story. And so the solutions always lie within the problem. And so when I'm meeting with someone for the first time, what I'm trying to do is really just to understand them, to ask lots of questions and to understand what are the problems that they're experiencing subjectively in their life and how are they creating those for themselves. And then on the flip side, what are the outcomes that they'd like to have? And then the question becomes, what story would you need to tell yourself? And I use the word story loosely because stories aren't always verbal. They're not always spoken. So we can watch movies and have pictures with no sounds and still can tell a story for ourselves. And sometimes the emotions that we have chained back and forth in our lives can tell a story themselves. But what we do is through a conversation, which is nothing more than a negotiation of stories, we're exploring how it is that you're creating the story for yourself that's creating the problems in your life, what outcomes you'd like to have in your life, and what stories you'd need to be telling yourself in order to have the life that you want to have. And then it becomes an interesting dance of conversation, of sights, of sounds, of feelings, of physical sensations, and sometimes even smells and tastes, to re-story yourself. Because the cool thing about stories also is that you are never the problem. And I'll say this generically, you. Dianne, you're never the problem. Whoever's listening to this is never the problem. Actually, the person who you think the problem is, if it's not you, it's the person, they're not the problem either. So the person is never the problem. But the cool thing is that the story is always the problem. The problem is always the story, because if I had the same stories in my mind that you had about the situation that you're in, I'd have the exact same problem as you. I promise you that. If anybody in the world had the same story around the situation as you, they'd have the same problem as you. And so the cool thing is that you're never the problem. The past is never the problem because the past is over with. The other people are never the problem because it's just your perceived story about them. And so the coolest thing is that the story is always the problem. And if I had your story, I'd have the same problem. And so if we can give you a new story, then you can have new results and a new experience in your life. And one of the coolest things about changing the stories that you're telling yourself is that when you change your story, reality changes like that. After a session, sometimes, for the client, a lot of the times, the world looks different. The world feels different. Something is not the same as it was before in my experience, just because the story has changed. And even as the facilitator, when I'm working with someone one-on-one, is that when we come out of an intense, focused flow state of a session, that the world looks different to me. And I'm not even the one who had the work done on me, in a way, But so it's a really cool, it's a conversation, but conversation is nothing more than a negotiation of meaning, of stories.
Oh, that's amazing. It's like I'm sitting here and I think about all the different profound ahas I've had in my life and how they happen in those things where there's this shift of the way I think. And I could define it as it changes the story even before I even knew anything about using language the way that you do. And I think that that's a really profound gift for people. So I'd like you to tell everyone a little bit about all your trainings. I know you do a lot of training and you're a master at it. Being in the audience with you teaching is just an amazing experience for me. I really have great respect for your skill and your manner, the way you teach things. But what kind of people would be good candidates to come to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a paradise, to learn some of these amazing things, because I think a lot of people are kind of curious and they don't really know, or only the used car salesman people do this NLP stuff, because they're trying to take advantage of others. Give us a little idea of what kind of people would be the perfect person for you to come to learn from you.
Well, I'll tell you this, if someone's made it this far through the interview and have bared with me, my ramblings on about stories, then you're probably the ideal candidate to join us in the training. Because one of the things about how I work is that all of our my trainings that I offer, they're maxed out at 10 people. So I keep them very kind of intimate, and throughout the days that we spend together, whether it's a 1-day Saturday course, a 3-day long weekend course, or even an 8-day NLP practitioner certification, or even a 12-day master practitioner certification, that throughout those days, we just wrapped up an 8-day NLP practitioner course last weekend. We had 10 people in there. We had one woman who was Israeli and 8 months pregnant. We had one woman who was Egyptian and came all the way out here through California. We had a guy in from Chicago who's a coach and a business owner. We had a photographer who was here. We had a business development. And so it's it's not about really necessarily how you want to use the tools. Everybody who joins wants to improve themselves, improve their communication skills. They want to take any sorts of knowledge that they can do and apply it to themselves so that they can become their best version of themselves, so that they can perform better, whether it's just in their personal life, in their professional life, in their business if they're an entrepreneur, with their family if they're a parent, or with their loved one or spouse. And so the kinds of people really range, but the main thing that's underlying is that number one is that if you can vibe with my personality and deal with me this long and feel like there's something that you can take from the training and really take it and apply it to your life, and it'll be valuable for you, and you're probably going to get really good along with the other people in there, because they all are there for the same thing, to take the tools and technologies, apply it to their lives personally and professionally, and to see what's possible in terms of yourself, your life, and human nature in general.
So if you're hearing Jason speak and you're listening to this conversation, or maybe you even get curious and check out our first interview where he tells more about his personal story, then you may want to make a trip to Fort Lauderdale to one of his trainings. So you can go to his website, which is
perceptionacademy.com.
Okay, that's perceptionacademy.com, and you will have that in the show notes. You can click on that. You can research all the different classes he's teaching and courses. There's always something going on that he does to help people get where they want to go. He's a very giving, amazing person. So go check him out. You can let him know you heard him on this podcast. People come to work with him from all over the globe. So there's no way that anybody can get away with saying, oh, well, Fort Lauderdale, it's too far away. In fact, I am going to be going diagonally across North America in just a couple days to learn from a really powerful person up off of Vancouver, Canada, and I'm in Florida as well. So if you really want to learn something and you're really all over, really growing and turning your stories into something that's really beneficial for you, I highly, highly recommend that you look up Jason and you contact him and just see where it goes. You will not regret it. So Jason, is there anything else on your heart that you would like to say to all of us before we end the show? And thank you so much for being on it.
Well, thank you so much for having me on here. Thank you so much to anybody who has given your time and energy and taken your time and energy to make this hour here part of your story. And hopefully there's something from this conversation that you can take with you and hold on with you for the rest of your life to have a profound impact in the way that you perceive things and the way you tell yourself stories. Because I think so much more important than the stories that we tell ourselves is learning how to tell ourselves better stories. And so rather than just taking away one good experience and being able to make that part of your story, hopefully there's something that you can take away from this conversation that will make you a better storyteller. And when I say storyteller, I don't necessarily mean telling stories to other people, but I mean the stories that you tell to yourself on a day-to-day basis, and learn to tell better stories to yourself that will allow you to unleash your highest potential and be a better leader for the next generation and for anybody and everybody who's watching you live your life and create your story. So thank you so much for having me on here, Dianne, and anybody who's been listening.
Oh, Jason, thank you so much for being here. And remember, everybody, all the links that you will ever need for Jason and for this show are going to be in the show notes so that you can contact him or follow all the neat things he's doing. He's got an amazing presence online, too. You can learn a lot from him just by watching all his different videos and content. It's hilarious. It's great. So I want to thank you very much. And I want to remind all of you to keep your face to the sun so the shadows fall behind you, because you're a rock star and you're here on purpose. The world really needs your gift. So go out there and let your light shine. And until next time, be well. Thank you for listening. I trust you gained some valuable inspiration and information. Please join me and other visionaries in the Someone Gets Me Facebook group. Or for more information on my services and additional episodes, visit someonegetsme.com. Again, thanks for listening.